Welcome to the Daily Devo. My name is Diana. Today we are talking about how God has spoken and how God does speak. In this Devo series, we are looking at what the book of Hebrews says about Jesus. Hebrews, it is reminding these earlier believers that Jesus is worth following and he's worth believing, especially when circumstances are challenging. The book is saying Jesus is better, Jesus is above, and Jesus is fulfilling all of those Old Testament ways that the Old Testament talked about and declared. That's what this letter is reminding these Jesus followers in. Well, from the very start, we can hear this. Listen to today's verse. It's found in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom also he made the universe." Today's verse, the first part of today's verse, it starts out by declaring this fact that God has spoken. This truth that God, the perfect, Holy One, the transcendent one, God, he chose to reveal himself to humanity. Think about that. From the start, God has drawn near to people. God has spoken with people. What a treasured truth. And I know we can become numb or familiar with this truth. Maybe this will help. Is there a conversation that you would be thrilled to have with a particular person? I know I've shared this before about how when I was little, I thought it would be so cool to get invited to tea with the late Queen of England, to sit in her parlor room and to ask questions and just listen to her stories. What about for you? Is there a famous athlete, musician? Is there a church father or church mother or a person in history or a person in your family you would so enjoy to have a conversation with? If the person you most desire a conversation with, think about this. If they reached out to you with a message, would you listen? Would you show up to that appointment? We would, right? Well, God, who again is the most brilliant, the most wise, the most holy, the most just, the most loving, the most creative, the most mindful, he's already spoken. He has let himself be known and heard by us. Think about the wonder of that. Well, Hebrews, it's declaring this truth right at the start that God did speak in the past. Remember, God spoke directly with Adam and Eve in the garden. God spoke to Abraham and Moses and many others throughout Scripture. God spoke through the prophets, and he even spoke through a donkey one time, for real. And he spoke in many other ways. And these early Jesus followers, when they heard this message, they would have agreed and remembered all the ways God has already spoken in the past. Well, the writer goes on to say that in these last days, in these New Testament days, in these days since Jesus' birth and death and resurrection, what they're saying is that God has spoken to us by his Son, Jesus. So Jesus is how God speaks to his people. This means that God is still communicating his heart, his ways, his help, and his glory. How? Through the person of Jesus, through the life of Jesus, through the work of Jesus. So what does this mean? It means that God still desires to be known and heard and speak with his followers. If you want to know what God is saying, look to Jesus. We read about Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We think about the actions of Jesus, what he valued, what his word said, and we can talk with Jesus in prayer. Today, I want to remind you that God has always been a God who's let himself be known and heard. God has always been a God who desires connection and conversation with people. Today, ponder this truth that God has spoken through Jesus. What do you notice God saying today? What do you notice about the way that Jesus walked through each day? Maybe what's standing out to you about Jesus is this sacrificial love, or maybe you're learning about this respect that Jesus showed others. Maybe you're noticing that Jesus had this strength that was always under God's control and how it was expressed. Look to Jesus today. God is speaking in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Ponder these things.